All right, so probably by now everybody's getting a little hungry. So I want you guys to think about if you're going to go grab something to eat, what's it going to be? Is it plants? Is it producers? Is it, oh, I'm going to get some chips or crackers or cereal, or I'm going to get a hamburger, or are you going to go for some seafood? And roughly 1.5 billion people in developing countries rely on the ocean for their food, for their protein source. It's big protein source for a lot of people. The tough part, when we look globally, about 90% of global fisheries are unsustainable. So we talked about tragedy of the commons. If you're not remembering that, go back and look it up. But this is why so much of the global fishery stock is collapsing. It's unsustainable the way we're fishing in today's world. We're using these giant trawling nets. If you look down at the bottom there, that's what that is. It's this giant net that's the size, you could fit airplanes inside of this thing. They drag it behind the boat, they run it across the bottom of the ocean, and just everything on the ocean floor gets scooped up into it. And a big problem here is there is all this stuff that they call the bycatch. Let me put that term up here for you guys. Bycatch is all the stuff that we don't want. Like, oh, I didn't want this turtle. I didn't want this dolphin. I didn't want this. I didn't want, etc. So these are not the things that you're aiming for. This is stuff that is not intended to be caught, but because you're using a giant net that catches everything, it gets caught. So there's huge environmental consequences when we use these big trawling nets, and we just kill millions of marine organisms every year unintentionally with our fishing practices. There's other things called purse seinings, long lines. Just the technology has improved dramatically to catch more fish, but the problem is there's fewer and fewer fish out there. I mean, you go back decades and you'd catch fish, different types of tuna and fish that they weigh 200, 250 pounds, where nowadays it's like, ooh, I got a 50 pounder, and that's considered a great, huge monster fish. It's not. It should scare us that we're depleting the ocean of a major resource. If we can change fishing practices and become sustainable, and as a species, the human population works together for sustainable fishing, we can have enough fish in the ocean for the human population, but we have to make major changes. If you look at that graph there, let me get the pen out. This is possible to do this and maintain global fishing stocks, recover these fishing industries that are collapsing or have already collapsed. If we work as a society, can we avoid tragedy of the commons? But if we just, well, let's keep doing what we're doing, we will see and continue to see fishing stocks decline and continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller because we're not doing it sustainably. So the challenge is getting people to agree and work for the benefit of all and the long-term benefit of all. So this is where aquaculture comes in. Can we farm raise fish? There's some pros and some cons. I mean, I want you guys again to make an opinion or get an opinion on this. Roughly half of our commercially sold seafood is raised through aquaculture. So economically, like, wow, there's over $1 billion of economic value there when we're farm raising fish, farm raising oysters, salmon, etc. You look at the map there, this is the NOAA fisheries map, shows you which states are primarily involved in this stuff and the value of aquaculture to those states. Major industry. Where do you think Illinois gets its fish from? Where do we get our salmon and our shrimp and our oysters and clams and mussels and so on? Well, you ain't growing them in Illinois. So we're importing them and bringing them in from the Gulf or from the Atlantic or the Pacific. And it will even indicate this is a Pacific farm-raised salmon versus this is a wild-caught salmon and so on. So again, the hope here is I want you guys to think about these things when you're out with your friends for dinner, or you're going to go to a restaurant, or you're going to swing through a drive-through. What are we eating, and is it sustainable? Is it something that, well, if I just do it once, it's not a big deal, right? But what if everybody in the car does it once, and then everybody in Springfield does it once, and then, well, maybe we go back a second time? Think about the bigger impact. So if we all make one little change for the benefit, that adds up to a really big impact and a really big benefit. So again, technology is awesome, but it's enabled us to destroy the ocean and deplete the fishing grounds. We can also use technology to improve the fishing grounds and to increase the yields of fish in the future if we work together. So remember the whole source and sink idea we talked about in lecture when we were going over populations? That's what we need to do more of when we talk about fishing and working in the oceans. Aquaculture, really cool stuff going on here. Different ways of doing it. You can farm raise in Illinois. We farm raise catfish here. You'd need a facility big enough to have those big holding tanks there and put in your so many catfish and bass and tuna, or not tuna, bluegill, etc. What's the market going to want? And then you farm raise them. Now, the negatives, though, just like confined animal operations for hogs and chickens and pork and or cattle, etc., you increase the likelihood of disease. Now, if you're medicating them, now you got antibiotics and all these hormones and all these different things that we probably don't want in our food going into those big tanks there. Once you've collected all the fish and you've sold the fish, what do you do with all that water? You dump it out in the yard? Do you dump it into the nearby river? So if there is a disease in there, now that gets dumped into the lake or the river. How is that going to impact native fish populations? So there are some negatives to aquaculture. Again, I want you guys to take a few minutes and explore pros and cons. Pick a side. Do I support aquaculture? Do I not support aquaculture? Why? Give me the reasons. Use the science to support it or the science to oppose it. Base it in science, not in emotion, not in what I was told, but base it in science when you're picking which side of the argument or discussion you want to get on. So, all right. So we've got lots of ways food's produced, lots of pros and cons and things to think about here. The next topic to touch base on is what's known as the Green Revolution. This is something everybody in this class can tie into and have a future career involving the Green Revolution. It's estimated 70% of our new growth in ag will come from higher yields and new crop varieties. You guys want to be involved in environmental science in the agricultural side of it? Jump into this. Huge opportunities. We got that new ag building. We're trying to grow that program. If you have the interest, awesome, awesome opportunities. You'll come at it from a different perspective than most traditional ag students. So it'll give you an advantage in some cases. So an example of how we're doing this green revolution in new crops is this plant in the picture here called the winged bean. You eat the whole thing, the whole plant, not just the bean seed, but you can use the stems, you can use the leaves, you can use the whole plant as a source of nutrition. So they've genetically engineered it, crossbred these things to make them completely edible, top to bottom. So it increases nutritional value if you can eat more of the plant than just the seed. So again, think about corn. It's probably an easier one to envision. You eat the ear of corn. You don't eat the cob. You don't eat the husk. You don't eat the stem. There's a lot of corn plant that doesn't get eaten. Imagine if you could eat the whole thing. How much more energy we could get from these crops. That's the idea of the Green Revolution. We're not making more land. We're actually losing farm ground to development. So as we lose farm ground to development, we have to increase the yields we get from those farms to maximize food availability for people. And one thing that we see happening is there's a lot of different things going on in regards to agricultural industry. So to increase our yields, and the average corn yield has gone up about 25 bushels per acre over the last several decades. But to do this, we are finding ways to do different things with our crops, whether it's breeding, different breeding techniques, or crossing genetics, new fertilizers that are more effective and more potent, and then irrigation. All of these things are being done to increase the yields. So all sorts of ways to tie into this when we talk about environmental science and agriculture, and those two disciplines kind of merging together or intersecting each other. So you may specialize in water issues. Irrigation's a big thing with agriculture. You may specialize in chemistry and fertilizers. Can we now come up with a different fertilizer that the plants absorb instantly like that, instead of possibly running off and winding up in the aquatic system? So all different ways to get into this green revolution. Point to make here, it's not going away. We need to do more of it if we want to sustain the human population and continue to allow our population to grow. So one of the big, I don't want to call it hot button topics, but big topics when we get into agriculture is GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So take a look at the infograph here. I'm not going to read everything to you. You guys can read through it. You're completely capable. I want you to get a little more educated. What is a GMO? What are the pros? What are the cons? Do you even know if you're eating GMO foods? That's a big thing. Should we push for labeling? Allow consumers the opportunity to make a decision. Do I want to eat a GMO food or not? But without that on the label, we don't know. All right. So there's some concerns associated with GMOs. It's estimated that about 60% of all processed foods in America contain GMO or genetically modified ingredients. So now there's that challenge. If I have a hamburger, the cow's not genetically modified, but if the cow eats corn that's genetically modified, that carries through into the cow, that then carries up to me. It goes through the animal, or is incorporated into the animal. Is that an issue? Is that a problem? We may say, well, I don't directly eat a GMO, but indirectly we may have a connection to GMOs because of the different things we eat. All right, so in our last part here, we will talk about food production policies. We'll look at the concerns associated with GMOs in the next lecture here, okay? Almost done.